that's definitely a message that I give to young people who are wanting to get to do something similar, because, I didn't have anyone in my family who did anything similar. I think everybody thought I was a bit mad with this sort of pipe dream. And it was a real case of trial and error and taking voluntary jobs and trying to find my way around how things worked.
Welcome to the SheClicks Women in Photography podcast. I'm Angela Nicholson, and I'm the founder of SheClicks, which is a community for female photographers. In these podcasts, I talk with women in the photographic industry to hear about their experiences, what drives them, and how they got to where they are now. This episode is with Sue Flood, an acclaimed photographer, filmmaker and zoologist with a passion for adventure and wildlife. For 11 years, Sue worked with the BBC's Natural History Unit, working on documentaries such as The Blue Planet and Planet Earth, and collaborated with Sir David Attenborough. Since then, Sue's photography has taken her across the world, packing in adventures such as living with Siberian reindeer herders, swimming with humpback whales, camping amongst emperor penguins, and tracking bears in British Columbia. Hi Sue, thank you so much for joining me today on the SheClicks Women in Photography podcast.
Thank you, lovely to be here, and thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So let's start right at the beginning of your photography story. Where does your passion for photography, and in particular wildlife photography, come from?
Well, when I was a kid, my father and my grandfather were keen members of the local camera club, and they were always out with their cameras. So, I was used to seeing them do their photography, although there was a standing family joke about how awful my father's numerous pictures of gulls around the world were. And then when I was at school, I bought my first camera, sort of second hand, in a local shop in North Wales, an old Nicholson. And it's funny actually, because a friend recently said, "Oh, I always remember you always had a camera with you." But my very first photo I took when I was about 2 years old, and luckily that was captured for posterity, which was me using my grandfather's old Canon when I was 2.
Oh, wow.
To take a picture of a cockatoo at the local zoo. It's progressed a bit since then.
Yeah, but so it really came early to you then.
Yeah, and like I say, I was always like many kids. I loved wildlife and loved animals and loved having a pet, and but we were fortunate to have a very good zoo. Of course, there are bad zoos and good zoos, but Chester Zoo was the closest one to me, and my parents and my grandparents would often take me there, and so it was amazing to see these animals at the time, but I never dreamt I'd see them in real life, as it were. So it was really seeing animals and having that exposure, no pun intended, to photography with my father and my grandfather.
That's really interesting, because I've spoken to a few wildlife photographers, and it's actually been their love of wildlife that's come first, but it seems like yours were pretty much simultaneous.
Well, I'd say more so the wildlife, more so the animals than the photography, to be fair. But it's funny, I have distinct memories of my grandfather cutting out letters out of a template to put on the carpet to make a title for his slideshow, things like that. So needless to say, things have moved on somewhat in the last few decades.
Yes. Gosh, yeah, that's old school. So how did it turn into a career for you?
Well, at school, I remember being asked when I was about 15, what would you love to do when you leave school? And as a child growing up in North Wales, both at primary school and at senior school in Chester, I'd watch wildlife documentaries with my parents, weekends, sitting down to watch some David Attenborough documentary, as so many people did and still do. And, it was just this incredibly exotic world away from this little village in North Wales to see these incredible sights in the natural world. And when I was asked that question of what did I want to do, I said, I'd love to make wildlife films with David Attenborough. Now, that's when I was 15, and it just seemed to me the most incredible job to if you were interested in wildlife and the natural world and conservation, and traveling the world, it just seemed extraordinary. I was told actually by my teacher, well, no one gets to do that. How about domestic science?
Oh, yeah, they're the same.
Exactly. Literally for the world of history, that never happened. And then I didn't get encouraged in that, although I must say about 6 or 7 years ago, I was invited back to my old school to go and give a speech in Chester Cathedral on prize giving day and was able to tell that story. And so, of course, my message that day was follow your dreams, don't be put off by people. But yeah, so I started, that's when I sort of said I'd like to do that. And I went to university and studied zoology at university and kept writing. I started writing to the BBC, to the Natural History Unit, saying, I'd love to make wildlife films with David Attenborough. And I was very fortunate that my letter landed on the desk of a really lovely man called Mike Salisbury. And Mike was an absolutely brilliant producer who ended up producing he was the series producer on many of the Attenborough series, like the Bird series and many others. And he was just a brilliant producer and a very nice man. And he wrote a letter saying, so of course, snail mail, saying, well, we do get lots of letters from people who want to be wildlife filmmakers. However, if you can show us how keen you are by, we need to see something apart from a zoology degree. And it's like, oh, crikey. So I concentrated on trying to get experience that I thought would get the BBC to take another look. Because as you can imagine, still, many decades on, lots of people still write to the Natural History Unit saying they want to make films with David. So I did my zoology degree, and my really big break was, if you remember it, Operation Rally, as it used to be, and then Rally International. And that was being launched whilst I was at Durham. And a friend of mine said, why don't we apply for it? And I said, oh, God, you're never going to get on something like that. And she said, oh, no, come on, let's apply. Because I'd seen it on TV and wow, didn't that look amazing? So we applied, and I remember this slightly terrifying interview of sitting in this room in the local college, being interviewed by these sort of fusty old men in suits and pocket watches, and it seemed very stuffy and old, and I thought, well, I'm never going to get on. And I did manage to get on. And I volunteered for the Queensland National Parks and Wildlife Service in Australia for 3 months, and it absolutely changed my life because it gave me the opportunity to do things that I never dreamt I would get to do. I never thought I'd go to Australia. I never thought I'd work in a rainforest or go caving in the outback or dive on the barrier reef doing dive surveys. So all these things, it was the ability to, I guess, inspire me that, look, give it a try. And I came back from that determined to at least give it a go. And I thought, well, try and get this dream job with David Attenborough, and at least if you don't, you tried. And I said I'll give myself a year, and then after a year, I was a bit closer, and then I'll give it another year. Anyway, 7 years after writing my first letter to the BBC Natural History Unit, I finally got my job. So it was like winning the lottery.
Fantastic. And what was your job title when you first started?
I was a researcher, and it was interesting because I'd started applying for different jobs, and certainly the experience on Operation Rally was very helpful. And I'd applied for a job on the Really Wild show and got through to something like the last 20 and then never got the job. But the series producer, a very nice man called Paul Appleby, had said, well, if you want to come to the studio and see how we make programmes, So I potted and I had this very exciting day in the studio in Bristol. And in fact, I was talking to Chris Packham about this at the Wildlife Photographer of the Year Awards recently because he was very kind and encouraging back then, as he still is. So I did that, and then this producer Michael Bright, who'd one of the people who interviewed me for that job, said, "Oh well, let us know how you get on, and next time you're in Bristol, come and see us." And of course, I wasn't in Bristol; I lived in North Wales. But in an attempt to make my own luck, I caught a bus to Bristol and went and had a coffee with them there in Bristol. And very fortunately for me, someone who was meant to have started as a researcher that very day had not turned up. And Michael said, "I don't suppose you've got any free time. We need this research doing." And I said, "Yes, I could do that." And I started that afternoon. So it was very fortuitous.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. It's really lovely, isn't it? That though, it does come down to numbers. They only needed one person and you got down to the final 20, but it wasn't right, the door is shut and bolted. It was left open and you had the courage to push it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely a message that I give to young people who are wanting to get to do something similar because, I didn't have anyone in my family who did anything similar. I think everybody thought I was a bit mad with this sort of pipe dream. And it was a real case of trial and error and taking voluntary jobs and trying to find my way around how things worked. And when I got to the last two for a particular job and didn't get the job, and they said, "Well, if you'd have had some TV experience, you'd have got it." But it was a catch-22. And then I started, as I say, started as a researcher. I got a 3-day contract. Wow. And then I got a 3-week contract, and then they were looking for a researcher on wildlife on one series presented by David Attenborough, of course. And that was my big break. So I was the researcher on that series. And then I heard that there was going to be this series called Oceans was the working title, which became The Blue Planet.
Right.
And, I'd done a lot of diving and other things starting at university, and that helped me get what was the dream job, really.
Oh, amazing. So did you work as a researcher the whole time when you were at the BBC?
No, I started as a researcher, then an assistant producer, then a producer director. So so that was the trajectory. So I was, on Blue Planet, I would be researching stories, and nearly everybody in the natural history unit has come from a background as either zoologist in the field. They've usually got at least a first degree in something like zoology or biology or paleontology, something like that. And some people, if they haven't got an academic background, they've certainly got amazing experience as field biologists. So, it's easier to learn to make the programs than to learn about the animals. So people definitely have a real passion for the subject. So, I was, as I say, researcher and coming up with stories, and then going out into eventually going out into the field, and then on something like The Blue Planet, because it was such a big series but quite a small team. So you had myself and my colleague Penny Allen. She and I spent a year researching stories, writing strips, budgeting things, and then going in the field for about 3 years. So it was just an incredible thing to be part of. It really was. And of course, working with David Attenborough. So dreams definitely come true.
Yeah. Sounds like an absolutely fantastic role. And you worked on several projects and key documentaries. Do you have a particular favourite?
Blue Planet was, I think it was just such an outstanding series. At the time, it was the BBC's most expensive ever wildlife series. So it was getting to do some things that I certainly never dreamt I'd do, whether it was swimming with narwhals or, seeing polar bears or whatever it happened to be. And it was a very steep learning curve, but I was working with world-class cameramen, and they were all men on that series, unlike the more recent ones. Some of whom were extremely good stills photographers. So it was really good to have exposure to that, so I could, obviously pick up some useful tips. But then also Planet Earth was another favourite, and on that I wanted actually more of a field job, so I could be in the field because that's what I love doing. And one standout of there was going to film humpback whales in Tonga for actually almost 10 weeks. It was a bit of a long slog, but it was just magical to be, in the water with this enormous marine mammal, 15 meters long, and literally next to them, within an arm's length of them, and having them, for want of a better word, accept you as you're swimming along with them in their car for a couple of hours. It was, magical experiences money can't buy, really.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, obviously, when we watch them on TV, we see the absolute highlights. But as you said, there are times when you're just out in the field for weeks and weeks, days and days, trying to get those shots. Were there ever any moments where you thought, "Oh, crikey, what am I doing?" Or did you always have the end goal in mind, and that kept you going?
Well, there were definitely experiences where it was challenging. And that said, actually, some of the most challenging things were some of the best trips. I'm thinking of one in particular where myself and the cameraman, Doug, who I worked with him, and then we ended up getting married after some time. But he and I were camping with some Inuit friends, and we were on the ice for 6 weeks. Now, when I'm at home, I like 1 or 2 showers a day. And I did not have a shower for 6 weeks. There was no shower, no loo. We're just in a little tent,
Oh, crikey.
all of us on the ice. So that was quite a challenge. But, my God, what an absolute incredible privilege to get to go and spend time in the Arctic seeing the amazing wildlife that, again, I've had the privilege to see for the last few decades, whether it's polar bears or narwhals or belugas or king eiders or just and it was my times sort of working in the polar regions that just really captured my imagination. Hence me, that's I guess the most beautiful place that I love to go. There's nowhere quite like the Antarctic.
Because I was going to ask you about that, because I know you do go to warmer climes occasionally to photograph things, but you do seem particularly drawn to the colder areas. And I like skiing, I like surfing, but I have lots and lots of layers on and a winter wetsuit even when it's summer and things like that. I'm not a fan of the cold. So I just wondered, what is it that really attracts you? Is it just the beauty?
I think certainly the beauty, the sheer scale. When you're there in a little Zodiac and you're cruising around icebergs that are the size of skyscrapers, or I've been fortunate to travel to the Ross Sea a number of times. So to step inside Captain Scott's hut or Shackleton's hut and to see these extraordinary places, these historic huts that it feels as though someone's just walked out of them, to have some amazing experiences like swimming with leopard seals or standing on the ice in the Arctic and watching polar bears. So certainly, the fact that these wilderness areas are both remote and stark and also challenging. I mean, North Wales can get cold, but not quite on the same scale.
I could feel myself getting goosebumps when you were talking, and it's not thinking about the cold. It was thinking about the things you were saying, like, Captain Scott's hut and seeing some of those amazing animals and icebergs the size of skyscrapers. It does sound awe-inspiring.
Yeah, it really is. And, I've had oh gosh, it must be around 80 trips now to the Antarctic. And if you were going to say to me, you're allowed one more trip before you stop traveling, I would still pick the Antarctic. It's crazy, isn't it? And of course, you're trying always to think of what can you do about your carbon footprint. So I'm trying to do back-to-back trips. I'm trying to fly less. I'm doing more in the UK and more in Scotland and going, taking public transport and things like that. But trying to get to the other side of the world, to the Ross Sea, is obviously requires being on a boat, being on a ship, I should say. And so I'm been fortunate to be asked to be what's called a photo ambassador for the French company Ponant, and I go on board and teach people photography and help them get the best out of the trip and get to travel to the Arctic, to places like the North Pole, literally to 90 degrees north, down to the Ross Sea and other unbelievable locations. So it's definitely the dream job if you like wildlife, like photography, like the polar regions. So,
and you got a big coat, yes.
And you've got a big coat, exactly. Although I have actually swum at the North Pole in my swimsuit.
Oh my word! Good grief! I can't begin to imagine how cold that must have been.
Well, water, of course, it freezes at, let's see, minus 1.8. So at least we know. And sometimes it's warmer in the water than it is on the surface.
True.
So it's certainly very invigorating.
Yeah. Okay. So if you were making that final trip, so we know where you'd go, but is there a particular species that you would want to photograph one last time, or maybe for the first time?
That's an easy one. There is nothing to beat an emperor penguin. So in the Antarctic, it would be emperor penguins. They are the most stunning bird and just so well adapted to the extreme life that they have. And I'm sure we've all seen pictures of them where they're huddled together through the winter. I've been very fortunate to twice be invited to work at the most southerly emperor penguin colony in the world, and I'll be going back again in 2026, where you can fly into the Antarctic and just a small group of us get to go and camp near the emperor penguin colony and go and see those birds. It is just magical. And to be in a colony of thousands of birds and just a few of you there is obviously, again, a huge privilege. And if it was the Arctic, then I guess my last trip I'd want to do something with polar bears, which is just, incredible mammals. And I've been very lucky to make a couple of films about polar bears with the amazing biologist, Professor Ian Sterling, who sadly passed away last year. But, and again, working with these extraordinary scientists and people like David Attenborough is, again, like winning the lottery.
Is there a species that you haven't photographed yet that is on your list that you'd like to photograph?
Yes. Actually, in March, I am going to photograph tigers for the first time. And I'm very much looking forward to that. That was actually meant to happen in 2020. And I was in Japan about to fly to India when I got a phone call late at night saying, you're not going to be able to go. And we all, of course, know why. So I had to return to the UK rather than flying to India. So I've been waiting all since then to go. So that's certainly up there. But I would love to photograph Siberian tigers, and that's a very tricky call. But yeah, I do like working in the cold, but I'm for the last, I think it'll be the 14th year, I go to Zambia every year in the South Langwa National Park, which is one of the world's great wildlife hotspots. So I do love going there, and fantastic for leopards and other big cats, but I would love to see a pangolin or an aardvark, both of which are that's a big ask, but one of these days.
Yeah, I can imagine the sort of creature that you see them and then you do a double take because they are so unusual looking, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. My husband Chris came out to join me on a safari a few years ago, and he'd never been on safari. And on his first day, God, unbelievable, he got to see an aardvark. Ah, and he just had the most extraordinary kind of what I call beginner's luck of seeing wild dogs hunting, and saw an aardvark and saw a lion kill and all sorts of things. And I said, it's not normally like this.
Yeah, don't get used to it.
Exactly. So,
Now, you've got an image shortlisted in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year People's Choice Award, and there's only 25 images shortlisted from almost 60,000. So that's an incredible achievement just by itself. You must be pretty excited and proud.
thank you. I am excited and proud, not to mention astonished. I Yeah, I mean, obviously, Wildlife Photographer of the Year is such a prestigious competition, and I've been entering it for a long time, and it's really lovely to have made the last 25. Who knows if I'll get any further? Maybe not, maybe. But just to have got in the last 25 out of, yeah, as you say, 60,000 entries is really lovely. I'm the only British woman, certainly the only Welsh woman, and it's really lovely to have made it that far. So with a picture I took in the Antarctic, so a Weddell seal. So I'm really pleased about that.
Well, it is a lovely image, and I have shared it in SheClicks, so I'm hoping that lots of people have voted for you because it would be absolutely amazing to see you win it.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned that there's not many women shortlisted. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be, or maybe women not entering so many competitions?
I think that I think traditionally it has tended to be quite a male-dominated hobby, but though of course that's changing thanks to great organizations like Girls Who Click and yourself with SheClicks, and people encouraging women and girls in photography. I think that, perhaps more traditional roles in the past, where perhaps the woman was staying at home with kids and the father might have been going out to work. I mean, again, that's very traditional, isn't it? And things have changed now, happily. But when I said I wanted to be a wildlife photographer, it wasn't met with great enthusiasm at home. And it is a hard job. And I remember someone saying to me, another woman saying, unless you want to do this more than anything else, just don't even think about it. And, I don't have kids, so that's a consideration I haven't had. But then I know really outstanding female photographers who were also filmmakers, like the amazing Vicky Stone, who sadly passed away quite recently. And she was a brilliant filmmaker and brilliant photographer, working with her husband, Mark Diebel. And they had two sons who they had a very unusual setup and managed to make that work. But of course, that's the exception to the rule. But I'd say, generally speaking, it's probably a career that's quite difficult to run if you've also got a family at home, but not impossible. But yeah, I hardly have enough time to look after myself. God knows how I'd manage to if I got kids. But yeah, it can certainly be done. And but I think it's not easy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what advice would you give to anyone thinking of entering an image into a wildlife photography competition?
Well, entering an image into a wildlife photography competition, definitely do it for starters. I remember years ago, fantastic photographer called Zena Holloway, and I'd taken a photograph of a great white shark, and she saw this photograph and said, you should enter it for a contest. And my first thought was, oh, well, there's no point. I'm not going to win anything, in that incredibly positive way I have.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, well, somebody's got to win it. You've got to be in it to win it and all that. And so I did enter a competition, and then lo and behold, I placed somewhere in the competition, which then encouraged me to have a go. A bit like, when I was on Operation Raleigh, wanting to work with David Attenborough. And then I entered another competition and actually won the competition overall. As I say that, I'm still amazed, with a photograph of this humpback whale, mother and calf. And it was the International Conservation Photography Awards that Art Wolf had started up. So it was really nice to get that encouragement. And of course, it gets your work out there. So definitely enter, but also just trying to look for something different. And now I guess I've got the experience that, generally speaking, when I take a photo, you press the button and you know that there's something about what you've just seen. And I can think of a shot in particular that I've actually entered for Wildlife Photographer of the Year this coming year. They've just entries closed recently, and I was in the Arctic and I was looking at something and I thought, whoa, that's amazing. And it just was one of those moments when you thought, oh, there's something about this that it is unusual. So it's a case of, trying to find something that's not run of the mill and that's special and artistic. However, so much easier said than done.
Yeah.
And also another good bit of advice: don't leave things to the last minute. And they always say this, don't they, on the websites. And I'm fortunate to have something else in the finals of Travel Photographer of the Year this year. It's the first year when I've actually not left things till the last minute. So, yes, do as I say, not as I do.
Yes. Finally taking the advice there, Sue.
Exactly.
But I think there is something to be said for planning when you enter. I spoke to someone a while ago and they said that they have the competitions in mind because, the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, it comes up every year. So it's coming. So start preparing your images as you get them, or as you come across them. I think that could be one.
Yeah.
Process it, get it ready, prepare it. You might not enter it that week, but you can, wait until it's time to enter it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely good advice. And I did actually start putting aside things as I took them this last 12 months into a little folder. And then it's quite nice because you can go back to them and think, God, why on earth did I pick that? It's rubbish. Or oh, actually, I quite like that. And then I work with a friend of mine often, and he's a fantastic photographer. And I will ask his opinion about things as he will ask mine. And it's funny because we're both the same, where I'll pick something and then he'll, and actually the photo in Wildlife Photography of the Year, I wasn't going to bother entering. And he said, oh, you should enter that. And so, and then, I'll pick something maybe that he's overlooked. So it's quite nice having that second opinion.
Yeah. I hope you've bought him a drink.
I have indeed.
Good. Okay, well, I think it's a good time to go to 6 from SheClicks. I've got 10 questions from SheClickers, and I would like you to answer 6, please, by picking numbers from 1 to 10. So could I have your first number, please?
7, please.
Number 7. What have you found the most difficult species to photograph in the way that you want, and why? And that question is from Liz.
Oh, well, thank you for the question, Liz. Great question. I would say probably polar bears above, on the surface, polar bears, because the conditions can be really quite challenging. It's not just a case of, drive along in your car, get out, go and photograph something, and then back home to a nice comfy bed and a hot meal. So the conditions can be quite challenging if you're camping on the ice and so on. And of course, the huge mammals, and potentially dangerous, and of course, like every other animal, has to be treated with respect. But I think that it's difficult in terms of the conditions and trying to get the behaviour. And when you're spending time camping on the sea ice, that is definitely a challenge, but incredibly rewarding when it happens. And then otherwise, underwater, humpback whales were definitely a challenge because, it's one thing when you're on the surface. I remember having this conversation with a couple of cameramen at the BBC because, if you're on the surface and you're, say, in a safari vehicle and you've got your long lens that you can balance on your tripod mount or whatever, then you can be a long distance away from something and get decent behavioural shots. But if you're underwater, you can't use that long lens. You're having to use a wide angle to be close to your subject. And so trying to photograph a, 45-foot long, 15-metre long whale and yet be close enough to it that you're going to be able to get a decent shot and be safe and so on is got its own challenges. And I did indeed end up I was this shoot for Planet Earth. I ended up, unfortunately, it certainly wasn't the whale's fault, getting bumped into by this whale, and did end up having to go to hospital with a suspected broken ankle. But as I say, that was just a calf that was sort of flopping around in the water, but a 1-ton calf was, you don't really want that bumping into you, but that was absolutely my fault, not the calf's fault. But yeah, that was a tricky one as well. But again, what a thrill! Lucky me.
Well, imagine getting out of the water with an injured ankle is a whole different kettle of fish from, hobbling along back to the Jeep to get back.
Yes, it certainly was. And it's funny because when I went to the hospital in Tonga on the bus, long story short, and they didn't even have an X-ray machine that worked. And then I thought, and the doctor advised resting up, of course. And then I thought, I'll go and get it seen to properly when I get back to Bristol to the BBC, which I did. And I went into the doctor's and she said, "So how have you hurt your ankle?" And I was bumped into by a humpback whale, and I just remember her starting to laugh.
Of course you were. Yes, I can imagine. She's probably telling that story.
Yeah.
And this woman came in. That's amazing. Okay, could I have your second number, please?
3.
As a wildlife photographer, what are the most important things to consider to capture a great image? How do you get close without disturbing the wildlife, for example? And how do you get attractive backgrounds? That question is from Carmen. So that's probably 3 questions in one.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Well, the most important thing is, beyond everything else, welfare of the animal. You don't want to do things that are going to disturb the animal to make it change its behaviour or fly away or run away or swim away, whatever it is. So that's sort of number one consideration. Patience. As my mum used to tell me, how come you're so patient with animals and not with people? I can spend ages just sitting waiting for something. And it's a challenge, isn't it? It's sort of field craft, so it's knowing something about the thing that you're filming. And like everything else, the more you practice and the more you use those skills, the better you get. And learning about the behavior, and actually, no amount of observation is ever going to go to waste, whether you're sitting watching birds in your garden. I mean, I've got a bird feeder out here. It's fantastic. I seem to be spending a small fortune on at the moment feeding the birds. But, if you're photographing something like leopards in the South Wangwa Valley, they're in the national park, then, if you're watching them stalking and you can just sort of get into the mindset of that animal and hopefully predict what they're going to do. Now, you can't do that the first time you go and do it, but after many, many trips doing that, you can get to know the place. And of course, working with the brilliant local guides who have become good friends over the last 14 years and learning from them, and definitely sort of practicing field skills and thinking about backgrounds. So, and just little things that, well, I say they're little, but just slow movements. Don't go waving your long lens around. You just need to move slowly and quietly and keep your voice down, or wearing the right clothing. If you're on safari, don't go wearing day glow neon colours. And again, slow, careful movements. And I know this is a funny thing, but it's remarkable the number of times when I'm teaching photography and people will say that they just bought a new camera for a trip. And I can, of course, understand that you're excited about going on the trip, but learn how to use that camera before you go. I've got my camera set up, so I've got, my shutter button, my aperture. I can change everything without taking my eye from the viewfinder. But yeah, certainly hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so your third number, please.
And 5.
What advice would you give to anyone wanting to be involved in photography for television, so perhaps being a camera person? That question's from Janina.
There's a number of routes that are open to you, and there's something called Wild Screen, which is very useful. That's a big wildlife film festival that takes place in Bristol every couple of years. There's an equivalent in the States, Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival. There's something called the International Association of Wildlife Filmmakers. So trying to get out and, learn from watching as well. I mean, there's some great behind the scenes videos. I mean, I love these. I love the making of some programs, and so many people seem to like those. How did we make these things? And also getting experience, and often, if you can find some kind-hearted camera person who'll maybe give you a chance to go and help out, volunteer, shadow them, then that can be invaluable. And I was fortunate to be encouraged. Fantastic cameraman Hugh Miles, who made some brilliant documentaries, and he was very kind, letting me tag along with him in the UK and go filming in Scotland and so on. So yeah, just trying to, and I have to say, now I think some things are easier, although there's of course a lot of competition, and things are a lot cheaper to be able to, make your own short film. I mean, God, you can even do something on an iPhone for that matter. But and the resources that are available on YouTube, so things that you don't have to pay for, and of course being able to film on an SLR or a mirrorless, whatever, to be able to make films without having to invest in something like an Arriflex or a Bolex that used to be the case many years ago. So certainly those costs have come down. So that is what I would advise. And there are also, fantastic courses available where you can, whether it's a degree course or, a shorter term sort of getting your foot in the door type course, and anything you can do.
Okay. Would you like to pick your fourth number, please?
8.
Number 8. What are your views on the environmental impact of photography tourism on the Arctic? Is it still sustainable? And will it stay sustainable? That's also from Janina.
Thanks, Janina. Is it sustainable? I think that organisations like IECO, where they're looking at, for example, Arctic operators going to photograph wildlife in the Arctic and places like Svalbard and so on, and of course Canadian Arctic, you have to adhere to guidelines, not approaching within a certain distance and so on. So those regulations are there to protect the wildlife. I'm a firm believer that, and I'm paraphrasing David Attenborough here, but you have to show people how beautiful something is for them to want to protect it. And those images, that's what grabs people's attention. If you're flicking through a magazine or a newspaper, you'll see that image, or on the TV, you'll see an image and you're drawn to that rather than the written word. Not that the content of the written word isn't important, but yeah, absolutely. We have to make conscious decisions about, I think, limiting tourism to the Arctic and Antarctic and to other places as well. And I think that the pressure that's on the natural world, and it's only going to get worse, I think, is something that wildlife photographers, that anybody has to consider. How do we get there? Can we travel in a more sustainable way? We're going to be using local guides. Can we do back-to-back trips? Is the money that you're spending on your holiday, is the money going into local conservation projects? There are certain operators I know who will work and invest some of the money that they are making from your holiday back into conservation projects on the ground. So I think making an intelligent choice, an informed choice about which operator you're using and making sure they're operating in a responsible way is something that I'd highly recommend. But at the end of the day, we all have to do that, whether we're someone who's going on a holiday, somebody who's doing this profession, or maybe a bit of both. Just thinking as well about photography in the polar regions, maybe particularly the Arctic, it's taking images that might be able to tell a story and raise awareness of a particular situation. For example, it could be the percentage of what's called multi-year sea ice, which is massively decreased since I've been working in the Arctic. So, of course, polar bears need sea ice as a hunting platform to hunt for ring seal, their favourite prey, and the most numerous seal in the Arctic. Now, there was a wonderful photo that won People's Choice last year of a polar bear on a small piece of ice sleeping. Fantastic photo, and it's sort of images that tell a story and that can, bring attention to what is happening to the planet, to a particular species. And some of those images are very hard to look at, but they're important. And I think that that's the upside of being able to go and photograph in places, and you don't forget these images.
No, but they're not probably the images that you want to put on your wall and look at while you're eating your breakfast, but they are potentially competition winners because of the message that's behind them, and therefore they get spread around, or they may feature in all sorts of magazines, which has a lot of impact as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, good point.
Okay, thank you for that. Could I have your penultimate number, please?
9.
Number 9. What is the hardest part of photograph in sub-zero conditions, and how do you overcome it? That's from Caroline.
I far prefer it when it's a bit colder. What I don't like is when it's slushy at around about 0. That's what I really don't like. I find it much easier when it's about -10 or a bit colder, because it's nice and crisp. I have to say I'm very fortunate to have good circulation, and often, in fact, it's quite funny. I use Gitso tripods, and I'd made this short video with the help of my colleague Ian Dawson using my Gitso in the Antarctic. So I was standing there using it at a place called Foyne Island, photographing Adelie penguins, and someone had written in and said, "This woman obviously isn't in the Antarctic. She's just filmed this afterwards, because look at the way she's dressed." And I'd got a light Gore-Tex on, which was over a thick sweater. I wasn't actually wearing any gloves at the start of it, and it has to be pretty cold for me to start wearing gloves. And I wasn't wearing gloves. So this doubting Thomas, as it was a Thomas, thought that I wasn't in the Antarctic. I was faking it, but this was not fake news. I really was there. So the cold can be a challenge.
Okay, so your final number then, please.
1, please.
What advice do you have for protecting camera equipment in harsh conditions, and are there any mistakes to avoid?
Good question. I've just been trying to get myself very organised for a trip I've got to the Canadian Arctic. And when I'm on a Zodiac, I would always have my kit in a dry bag. And so I will wrap my cameras, rather than having them in a hard case, I'd have them in wrapped in what I call my camera nappies. So just like neoprene covers, soft neoprene covers that I can roll them up in, and then put them into a dry bag. And then that way, if you get some sort of splash, then you're going to have your kit safe. If it's raining, unless it was something like the Loch Ness Monster, I would not have my camera out in the rain. I travel with 3 bodies usually, so that if there was some sort of disaster, I've got a backup or 2. And actually, the photograph that's in the final of Travel Photographer of the Year this year, I took in heavy snow, and my camera did get a bit damp, so it's just I did have a cover on it, but the snow, it was really coming down thick and fast. So when I got my camera back on board, what I would always do is I would leave the bag, my dry bag, closed up. I would let it acclimatise in a warmer cabin for a couple of hours before I opened it, so I'm not getting a problem of condensation. And same thing with taking a camera out of a warm environment into the cold. So I'll pack my gear up, I'll have it in the dry bag, I'll put it out on the deck beforehand and let it cool down so that there isn't that problem with condensation. And whatever you do, oh dear, I remember someone coming to me with their camera saying, I took the lens off and I was drying it with a hairdryer. No.
Oh dear.
So yes, definitely that's not a top tip. So just look after your gear, and always good to travel with maybe a Ziploc bag and some packets of silica gel just in case if you need to remove a bit of moisture.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you. Well, Sue, thank you so much for answering all those questions. It's been absolutely fascinating chatting with you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very fortunate to do a job I love and which I never take for granted. I always say I have the best job in the world, and it's really lovely when people enjoy your images, and it's lovely to have the opportunity to speak to people. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for your questions. It's really nice.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SheClicks Women in Photography podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Special thanks to everybody who sent in a question. You'll find links to Sue's website and social media channels in the show notes. I'll be back with another episode soon, so please subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast platform and tell all your friends and followers about it. You'll also find SheClicks on Facebook, X, Instagram and YouTube if you search for SheClicks Net. So until next time, enjoy your photography.